I still remember the sound the ice made that night, like glass cracking under weight, like something breaking that shouldn't. This happened in the winter of 1998. I was 19 years old and working seasonal help at a small general store in eastern Kentucky, deep in the Appalachian foothills. The town had maybe 300 people if you counted everyone scattered through the hollers. Most folks came down to the store once a week for flour, sugar, kerosene, and batteries. Christmas Eve was always slow because people stayed home. They didn't want to be caught out after dark. Not because of crime, because of the cold. And because of the stories. The store closed at 6, but my boss asked me to stay late that night to restock shelves and clean up before the holiday. He lived just up the road and told me to lock up when I was done. He said if I needed anything, I could call from the store phone. But he also said the phone lines sometimes went down in bad weather. And that night, the weather was bad. Snow had been falling since noon, heavy and wet. By the time I locked the front door, it was nearly 8 o'clock, and the world outside had gone completely silent. No cars, no voices, just the low hiss of wind through the pines and the occasional creak of tree branches bending under ice. I finished wiping down the counter and turned off most of the lights, leaving only the back room bulb on so I could see my way out. That's when I heard it. A soft knock at the front door. I thought maybe someone had gotten caught in the storm and needed help. It wasn't unusual for people to stop by the store if they were stranded or lost. So I walked back to the front and looked through the window. There was a woman standing outside. She wore a long, dark coat and no hat. Her hair was wet and hung in thick strands around her face. She wasn't moving, just standing there looking at the door. I unlocked it and opened it halfway, letting in a gust of freezing air. I asked if she was okay. She didn't answer right away. She just stared at me with pale, tired eyes. Then she said very quietly, "Can I come in? I'm so cold." Her voice was flat, empty, but I didn't think much of it. People in shock sometimes sound like that. So I stepped aside and let her in. She walked past me slowly, dripping snow onto the floor. I asked where she'd come from, if her car had broken down, if she needed me to call someone. She didn't answer any of it. She just stood in the middle of the store, looking around like she'd never seen the place before. I noticed her hands. They were red and raw, like she'd been outside for hours. But there was no trembling, no shivering, just stillness. I grabbed a wool blanket we kept behind the counter and draped it over her shoulders. She didn't react. I asked her name and she said, "Anna." I asked if she lived nearby. She said, "I used to." That answer sat wrong with me, but I didn't push. Instead, I offered to make her some coffee from the pot in the back. She nodded, but she didn't sit down. She just stood there staring at the window. While the coffee brewed, I kept glancing back at her. Something about the way she held herself felt off, like she was waiting for something, or listening. I brought her a cup, and she took it without looking at me. She held it in both hands but didn't drink. I asked again if I could call someone for her. She shook her head slowly. Then she said, "I don't think they'd come." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just stood there, feeling the cold air still clinging to her, even though we were inside. That's when I noticed the floor. Where she'd been standing, there were wet footprints, but they weren't normal. They were too dark, almost black, and they didn't look like water. I crouched down and touched one of the prints. It was ice, solid ice, frozen to the floor in the shape of her boot. My stomach turned. I stood up quickly and looked at her. She was still staring out the window. I asked as calmly as I could where she'd walked from. She turned her head toward me, slow and deliberate. Her eyes were different now, darker, deeper. She said, "The hollow." There were a dozen hollows around that area, but I knew which one she meant. Everyone did. It was the one people didn't go into after dark, the one where a family had frozen to death back in the 50s, trapped in their cabin during a blizzard that lasted 9 days. They found the bodies in spring. The mother had tried to keep the children warm by holding them, but they all died together. I took a step back. She didn't move. She just kept looking at me with that hollow, empty expression. Then she said, "I've been walking a long time." I asked how long. She didn't answer. Instead, she set the coffee cup down on the counter. It didn't make a sound. And when I looked at it, I saw frost spreading across the ceramic, thin and fast, like breath on glass. I backed toward the phone on the wall. I didn't know who I was going to call, but I needed to do something. She tilted her head slightly, watching me. Then she said, "You shouldn't have let me in." My hand froze on the receiver. I asked why. She said, "Because now I can't leave." The lights in the store flickered. The temperature dropped so fast I could see my breath. I felt the cold sink into my chest, heavy and sharp. She took a step toward me. Her boots left more of those black frozen prints. I told her to stop. She didn't. She just kept moving, slow and steady, like she had all the time in the world. I don't know what made me think of it. Maybe instinct, maybe something my grandmother once told me. But I grabbed the salt container from behind the counter and poured a line across the floor between us. She stopped, not gradually, instantly, like she'd hit a wall. Her face twisted just for a second into something that wasn't quite human. Then it smoothed out again. She looked at me with something that might have been sadness or hunger. She said, "You'll let me in again someday." Then she turned and walked toward the door. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. She opened it herself, stepped out into the snow, and disappeared into the dark. I stood there for a long time, staring at the line of salt and the frozen footprints she'd left behind. When I finally worked up the courage to lock the door, I checked the floor again. The prints were gone. So was the frost on the coffee cup. But the cold stayed with me all night. I never told my boss what happened. I never told anyone until now. But every Christmas since, I think about her. About the way she said "I used to" when I asked if she lived nearby. And I wonder who else has opened their door to someone they shouldn't have. The thing about old houses in the mountains is they remember. And sometimes on the coldest nights, they want to remind you. Before we go further, I want to ask, are you listening alone tonight, or is someone there with you? Let me know in the comments. I'm always curious. This happened in December of 2004. I was living in a rented farmhouse outside of Boone, North Carolina, just off a gravel road that wound up into the hills. The house was over 100 years old, drafty and crooked, with floors that sloped toward the center and windows that rattled in their frames. But the rent was cheap, and I needed space. I was finishing my graduate thesis and wanted somewhere quiet where I could write without interruption. The landlord told me the house had been in his family for 3 generations. He said it was a good house, solid, but he also said I shouldn't be surprised if I heard things at night. Old houses settle, he explained. Wood shifts, pipes groan. I told him I wasn't superstitious. He just smiled and said, "That's fine. The house doesn't care." I moved in mid-November. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent most of my time at the kitchen table with my laptop, a space heater at my feet, and coffee going cold in a chipped mug. The house did make noise. Footsteps in the attic, doors that wouldn't stay latched, a faint whistling sound that came from somewhere in the walls when the wind picked up. But none of it bothered me. I grew up in the country. I knew how old houses behaved. Christmas Eve came on a Friday that year. I had no family nearby and no plans to travel, so I decided to spend the evening working. The temperature had dropped sharply over the previous few days, and by nightfall it was well below freezing. I made a fire in the wood stove and settled in with my notes, determined to finish a chapter before midnight. Around 9 o'clock, the power went out. It wasn't a flicker, it was instant. 1 second the lights were on. The next I was sitting in total darkness, except for the orange glow from the stove. I stood up and looked out the window. No lights anywhere, not from the main road, not from the neighbor's place half a mile down. Just black trees and a sky full of stars so bright they hurt to look at. I found a flashlight in the drawer and checked the breaker box in the mudroom. Everything looked fine, so I figured it was the grid. Happens all the time in winter. I sat back down and decided to work by flashlight until the power came back. That's when I heard the singing. At first, I thought I was imagining it. A faint hum carried on the wind, barely audible over the crackle of the fire, but it grew louder. Voices, multiple voices, singing in harmony. Silent night. I stood up and walked to the front window. There was a group of people standing at the edge of my driveway, maybe 6 or 7 of them, clustered together in the dark. I couldn't make out their faces, but I could see their shapes. They were dressed in long coats and scarves, old-fashioned looking, like something out of a postcard. And they were singing. I wasn't expecting carolers, especially not out here. But I thought maybe it was a church group or some local tradition I didn't know about. So I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and biting. The singing stopped. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of them called out, "May we come closer?" The voice was polite, formal, but something about it made me hesitate. I told them they were welcome to sing from where they were. There was a pause. Then the same voice said, "We've walked a long way. It would be kind of you to let us come to the door." I didn't like how still they were. No shifting weight, no rubbing hands together for warmth, just standing there, waiting. I told them I appreciated the gesture, but I wasn't feeling well and didn't want to keep them. Another pause. Then they started singing again. This time the song was different, not Silent Night, something older, slower. The melody was beautiful, but the words were strange. I couldn't understand them at first. Then I realized they weren't in English. I don't know what language it was, but the sound of it made my skin crawl. It felt wrong, heavy, like the words themselves had weight. I stepped back inside and closed the door. I locked it and stood there listening. The singing continued. Louder now, closer. I looked through the window and saw them moving up the driveway. Not walking, not exactly. It was more like gliding. Their feet didn't seem to touch the ground. My heart started pounding. I backed away from the door and grabbed my phone. No signal. I tried the landline, dead. The singing was right outside now, so close I could feel it vibrating through the walls. I turned off the flashlight and crouched down behind the couch, trying to stay out of sight. They stopped singing. The silence that followed was worse. I waited, holding my breath. Then I heard it. A soft knock at the door, 3 slow, deliberate taps. A voice called out, "We know you're in there." I didn't answer. Another knock, harder this time. "It's Christmas Eve. Let us in." I pressed my back against the couch, trying to think. The knocking came again, rhythmic and insistent. Then I heard something else, scratching, not at the door, at the window beside it. I crawled across the floor and peeked over the edge of the sill. One of them was standing right there, face pressed against the glass. I couldn't see details, just a pale blur where a face should be. And eyes, dark, empty eyes that didn't blink. I dropped to the floor and stayed there, shaking. The scratching moved to another window, then another. They were circling the house, testing it. The knocking continued, steady and patient. And then I heard the voice again, softer now. "We won't leave until you let us in." I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me not to open that door, but they weren't going away. I crawled into the kitchen and grabbed a canister of salt from the pantry. My grandmother used to tell me stories. old mountain stories, about things that walked at night, and how salt could keep them out. I moved to every window and every door, pouring a thin line along the sills and thresholds. My hands were shaking so badly I spilled half of it. But I didn't stop until every entrance was covered. The knocking stopped. The scratching stopped. I heard a low sound like a sigh or maybe a growl. Then, very faintly, the singing started again, but this time it was moving away, fading into the distance. I stayed on the floor until the fire burned out and the house went completely dark. I didn't move, I didn't sleep, I just listened. When the sun came up, I went outside. There were no footprints in the frost, no tire tracks, no sign anyone had been there at all. But near the front door, pressed into the wood, were 3 deep scratches, parallel, deliberate, like something had tried very hard to get in. I called the landlord that morning. I told him I was breaking the lease. He didn't argue. He just asked, very quietly, "Did they sing?" I said yes. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "My grandmother heard them too. Christmas Eve, 1947. She never spent another night in that house." I moved out 2 days later. I don't know what they were. I don't know what they wanted, but I know this. If someone comes to your door on Christmas Eve and asks to be let in, and you don't recognize them, and something feels wrong, don't open it, no matter how long they wait. Some gifts aren't meant to be opened, and some traditions are older and darker than the ones we celebrate now. If you're still with me, I'd love to know, what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. There's something comforting about knowing we're all awake together. This happened in the winter of 2011. I was working as a visiting nurse in rural West Virginia, covering a territory that stretched across 3 counties. Most of my patients were elderly, living alone in homes that had been in their families for generations. The work was hard but meaningful. I spent my days driving narrow mountain roads, checking vitals, delivering medication, and often just sitting with people who hadn't spoken to anyone in days. Christmas week was always busy. Families came home for the holidays, and suddenly there were questions about medications, symptoms, and whether Grandma really needed to see a doctor or if she was just being dramatic. But there were also people who had no one coming, and those were the visits that stayed with me. On Christmas Eve, I had one last appointment scheduled. A woman named Eunice Calloway, age 84, living in a cabin about 40 minutes outside of Elkins. I'd never met her before. She'd been added to my roster that week after her previous nurse transferred to another district. The notes in her file were sparse. Diabetic, mild arthritis, no immediate family, homebound. There was a handwritten note at the bottom from the other nurse. It said, "Patient prefers minimal conversation. Respectful, but distant. Do not ask about the back room." I remember finding that last part strange, but I'd worked with enough eccentric mountain folks to know that everyone had their quirks, so I didn't think much of it. I packed my bag, loaded the car, and headed out around 3 in the afternoon. The sun was already low, casting long shadows across the ridges. The road to her place was barely maintained. Gravel gave way to dirt, and then dirt gave way to something that was more like a suggestion of a road. My GPS lost signal about halfway there, but I had written directions. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow clearing, surrounded by dense woods on 3 sides. It was small and dark, with a sagging porch and a tin roof covered in pine needles. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin, steady line. I parked and grabbed my bag. The air smelled like wood smoke and damp earth. Everything was quiet. No birds, no wind, just the faint creak of trees settling in the cold. I knocked on the door. A voice called out from inside, low and firm. "It's open." I stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit only by a fire in a small stone hearth. The furniture was old but clean. A narrow bed in one corner, a table and 2 chairs near the fire, shelves lined with jars and tins, and sitting in a rocking chair near the hearth was Eunice. She was small and thin, with white hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her hands rested on the arms of the chair, knotted and still. She didn't look at me right away. She just kept staring into the fire. I introduced myself and told her I was there to check her blood sugar and make sure she had everything she needed for the holiday. She nodded slowly. "Go ahead." I set my bag down and pulled out the glucose meter. She extended her hand without a word. Her skin was cold and papery, but her pulse was steady. I tested her levels. Normal. I asked if she'd been eating regularly. She said yes. I asked if she had any pain. She said no. The whole time she never looked at me, just kept her eyes on the fire. I finished the check and noted everything in my log. Then I asked if there was anything else she needed. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You can go now." Not rude, just final. I started packing up my things. That's when I noticed the door. It was at the back of the room, half hidden behind a tall cabinet. Old wood, dark with age, and a heavy iron latch. There was something tied to the latch, a piece of red ribbon frayed and faded, and hanging from the ribbon was a small brass bell. I didn't mean to stare, but something about it pulled my attention. Eunice's voice cut through the silence. "Don't ask." I looked at her. She was watching me now, her eyes sharp and clear. I apologized and said I wasn't trying to pry. She held my gaze for a moment longer. Then she said, "You're the 3rd nurse they've sent this year. The other 2 asked. That's why they don't come back." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and turned to leave. But as I reached for the door, she spoke again. "If you come back tomorrow, don't come after dark." I told her I wasn't scheduled to visit again until after New Year's. She shook her head. "You'll come back." I didn't argue. I just left. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the way she'd looked at me, about the door with the bell, and about what she'd said. "You'll come back." I told myself I was overthinking it, but around 11 o'clock, my phone rang. It was the service coordinator. She said Eunice had called and requested a visit the next day. Christmas Day. She said Eunice specifically asked for me. I told her I'd go. I left early the next morning. The drive felt longer in daylight, and the woods seemed thicker somehow. When I arrived, the cabin looked the same. Smoke from the chimney. No other signs of life. I knocked. The same voice called out, "It's open." I stepped inside. Eunice was in the same chair, in the same position. But something was different. The door at the back of the room was open, just a crack, enough to see darkness beyond it. And I could hear something, a faint sound, like humming or breathing. I asked if she was all right. She didn't answer. She just gestured toward the table. There was a small wooden box sitting there, plain, unvarnished, no markings. She said, "I need you to take that with you." I asked what it was. She said, "It doesn't matter, just take it, and don't open it." I told her I couldn't take something without knowing what it was. She looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. Not anger, not fear, just exhaustion. She said, "It's been in my family for 6 generations, passed down every Christmas, and I'm the last one. There's no one left to give it to." I asked why she couldn't just get rid of it herself. She shook her head. "It has to be given, and it has to be accepted. That's the rule." I asked what would happen if I didn't take it. She looked toward the open door at the back of the room. "Then it stays, and so does what's inside." I felt the temperature drop, not gradually, all at once. My breath misted in front of me. The humming sound grew louder, and from the darkness beyond the door, I saw movement. Something shifting, something waiting. Eunice stood up slowly. She picked up the box and held it out to me. Her hands were shaking. She said, "Please." I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was the look in her eyes. Maybe it was the sound coming from that room. But I took the box. It was heavier than it looked, and cold, so cold it burned. She let out a long breath. The humming stopped. The door at the back of the room swung shut. The latch clicked. Eunice sat back down, and for the first time since I'd met her, she smiled. "Thank you." I asked what I was supposed to do with it. She said, "Keep it closed, keep it safe, and when the time comes, you'll know who to give it to." I asked how I'd know. She didn't answer. She just closed her eyes and leaned back in the chair. "Merry Christmas." I left. I put the box in the trunk of my car and didn't look at it again until I got home. When I brought it inside, I set it on a shelf in my closet. I told myself I'd figure out what to do with it later, but I never opened it, and I never went back to see Eunice. 2 weeks later, I got a call from the service coordinator. She said Eunice had passed away in her sleep, peaceful, no signs of distress. They found her in the rocking chair, hands folded, eyes closed. The cabin was left to the state. No family, no will. I still have the box. It sits in the back of my closet, wrapped in a blanket. I've never opened it. I've never told anyone about it. But every Christmas I hear it, a faint sound, like humming or breathing, and I know someday I'll have to pass it on.